So today we're going to talk about the history of Sioux City bridges, and this is going to go back to the 1860s. And I chose this. We talk about the bridges in Sioux City in various other contexts, but I've personally never done a program specifically on this. And I chose this because Sioux City was founded where it is because of the rivers that the coming together of the Big Sioux and Missouri rivers, and to a lesser extent the Floyd and Perry Creek in the Missouri. And so that was a major reason why Sioux City was placed where it is. But those rivers, in addition to being connections to other parts of the country, are also barriers. And so bridges were really key to the expansion of Sioux City and both its economy and just to its physical expansion as well. And so I thought it was an interesting thing to take a look at, especially in the 19th century. I find the process of building a big bridge like the old combination bridge to be quite fascinating, and we just happen to have some really great photography from some scrapbooks that were kept by the people that built both the original Missouri River Railroad Bridge and the combination bridge that kind of show each step of how those were built. And so I think you'll enjoy those photographs. But let's start out. The first really major bridge in Sioux City was the bridge, the first bridges across the Big Sioux River on what we call Military Road. Now, Military Road was ordered by General William Harney in December of 1855. And the idea of Military Road, now this is a picture going up into the Dakota Territory, so starting down here in Sioux City. The idea of the Military Road was to have a supply line up to Fort Pierre in the current capital of South Dakota. And then in addition to that, when Fort Pierre already existed, General Harney also established Fort Randall halfway in between. And the idea was they needed to get supplies that could be brought on steamboats to Sioux City, and then taken by wagons basically all the way up to the forts. And so that was one of the first big engineering things that was ever done in Sioux City. And for the first 10 plus years of Military Road's existence, the way the military got across the Big Sioux River was through Paul Pauquette's ferry. He was an early settler here in town, a fur trader originally, and he got the license to operate the ferry out in what today is North Riverside, and that's how they got things across the Big Sioux. But then in 1867, the U.S. military Corps of Engineers designed and built a wooden bridge. So that was the first wooden bridge across the river. Unfortunately, we do not have a photograph of that. I'm sure it was a pretty simple structure. And then that was around for about 10 years, and then it was replaced by a little more elaborate structure in 1877. And so the Army built two bridges, the first two bridges across the Big Sioux River for Military Road. Here I just have, this is a map inside Sioux City to kind of give you an idea of how Military Road worked. So the steamboats could unload stuff at the levee in downtown Sioux City, and Military Road just kind of followed the west bank of Perry Creek and ended up connecting to where Military Road starts now off of West 21st Street and runs all the way out to Riverside and across the Big Sioux River. And so that happens to be something that goes back to the very beginnings of Sioux City itself. Now, the first road besides those two U.S. Army, the first bridge across the Big Sioux River after those U.S. Army built bridges were the original railroad bridges that crossed the Big Sioux in what today is Riverside, and these were connected to Sioux City real estate developer and railroad promoter Samuel T. Davis, and then also to interests in Yankton, South Dakota, who built what was called the Dakota Southern Railroad in 1872 and 1873. And so here I have, so the Dakota Southern went from Sioux City to Yankton. So that was the original part. And then Samuel Davis also had another line called the Sioux City and Pembina that branched off of the Dakota Southern and went up to what today is Akron. And eventually it was extended all the way to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and called the Sioux City and Dakota Railroad. And in 1881, the Milwaukee Railroad took over all these various lines, and it became part of the Milwaukee system. And this just happens to be the right-of-way for the Dakota Southern and later the Milwaukee Road in Sioux City, starting downtown and making its way through the Prospect Hill area across West 3rd and West 4th Street, and then all the way out through Riverside and out across the Big Sioux. So now you might recognize this bridge if you cross the Military Road Bridge today into North Sioux. From what I can tell, that the railroad bridge that is there, at least the trusses and the piers, go back to 1879, and I'm sure it's been refurbished and such over the years, but it's looked basically this way since the late 19th century anyway. And that bridge opened in April of 1879, so this was the third railroad bridge constructed across the Big Sioux River, and it was built by the Dakota Southern Railroad initially, and it was built by Sioux City contractors James Lynch and Narcissus Despario, who were pretty major building contractors in the late 19th century. And that opened in April of 1879. And as I said, it was pretty quickly in 1881 made part of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul railroad system. Now, getting back to the Military Road Bridge, that 1877 bridge that the U.S. Army had built, it was destroyed in the Great Missouri River flood of 1881. And this is the flood that destroyed the original town of Vermilion, South Dakota, and forced it to be rebuilt. And this happens to be a picture of the flood in Sioux City. And we're on approximately where Floyd Boulevard is today and Gordon Drive, looking to the southeast. Today, like the railroad bridge that exists today would run across in this area. And so you can see there's a pretty good flood here in Sioux City in the kind of the south bottoms area of south and east of downtown. So that destroyed that military road bridge across the Big Sioux River. And so it had to be replaced, and the Army was no longer interested. They were kind of winding down the forts up in the Dakota Territory, and so they were no longer interested in replacing that bridge. And so it was up to Woodbury County and Union County, which at the time was still Dakota Territory, to build a new bridge. And so Woodbury County hired a bridge engineer named Horace Horton from Rochester, Minnesota, and he designed and oversaw the construction of the Woodbury County half of the bridge. And so what Woodbury County did was they built a stone pier right in the middle of the Big Sioux and then built the iron truss bridge that you see here to it. And at the time, Union County had less population and therefore less money, and so they built a wood trestle out to the pier. And that wood trestle lasted a few years. This bridge opened in 1882. In May of 1885, a farmer from Union County was moving some cows over the bridge to Sioux City from the South Dakota or the Dakota Territory side, and the wooden trestle that Union County had built in 1882 collapsed, and all the cows went in the river. And from my understanding, only one cow perished. They were able to recover them all. But that did end and so Union County had to, at the time, rebuilt another wooden trestle. And that lasted then until 1893. And so in this picture, you see this is the Woodbury County side that opened in 1882. Finally, Union County built a matching iron trestle out to the pier. And that was the work of Oscar Goodrich and John Robeson, who were contractors from I think, Yankton, I believe. And that opened in August of 1893. Now, the first really major bridge project was what I have termed the Omaha Railroad Bridge, but that's the Missouri River Railroad Bridge. So up through the late 1880s, Sioux City had no bridge across the Missouri River. And in fact, there were very few bridges across it at all. The first one, I think, opened in Kansas City in the 1870s. But the effort to get a Missouri River bridge at Sioux City goes clear back to the early 1870s with U.S. Congressman Asahel Wheeler Hubbard. And he founded what was called the Sioux City Bridge Company in 1872, and he also began the process of getting legislation from the U.S. Congress to give Sioux City permission to construct a bridge, because the Army Corps of Engineers at this time basically controlled the Missouri River, and you couldn't just build a bridge across the Missouri River because it was so important for navigation. So you had to build a specific height bridge. It either had to be a certain amount high or it had to be a drawbridge of some type. And so you had to get permission from Congress, and that, of course, took some time. Now, Congress did pass a bill that gave Sioux City permission to build what they called a high bridge. And so this is a bridge about 50 feet above the high water mark of the Missouri River. And that was passed in August of 1876. But the Sioux City Bridge Company really never got the financing in order. It worked with various railroads to try to get interest in doing it, and it didn't come about for some time. And they had two locations in mind. One was from what today is Wesley Way across to what today is South Sioux City. And then the other one was down at what was called Sawyer's Bluff. And so this is James A. Sawyer's house that was on the bluff above what today is Interstate 29 and south of the Stockyards District. And the idea was to build from there then across to the Nebraska side. For various reasons, the downtown location was considered a problem. And so the Sawyer's Bluff location was eventually settled upon. So come in the 1880s, well, actually, first we got to go back to the 1870s. There was a railroad built from Sioux City to St. Paul, Minnesota. So the Sioux City and St. Paul built from Sioux City up to St. James, Minnesota, which I have marked with the blue. And then another railroad was constructed from St. Paul to St. James, and it met. And in 1882 or 1880, it became part of the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Road. So the Omaha Railroad, which in turn in 1882 became part of the Chicago Northwestern system. And this is who would eventually build the first big Missouri River bridge at Sioux City. So here we have an early drawing of what they initially contemplated building across the Missouri. And it was going to be a 3-span bridge. So there are going to be 3 iron spans and 4 piers, going from Sawyer's Bluff over to Nebraska. Eventually, that was changed to be 4 spans and 5 piers, so it had to be made bigger because of how the Missouri River was at that time. It was designed by George Morrison and Elmer Courthill of New York, who were very prominent bridge designers at the time. The contractor, it appears to be for the substructure, was just the Sioux City Bridge Company itself, which was at that point owned by the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. And then the superstructure contractor was Baird Brothers from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so what happened was the Chicago and Northwestern bought the Sioux City Bridge Company's existing charter to build a high bridge at Sioux City in May of 1887. And so they therefore had the permission to start building it. So now we have a picture from that scrapbook of the actual construction, and this is the building of Pier Number 1, which was the first pier along Sawyer's Bluff to the on the shore, basically, of the Missouri River. And with this pier, this pier went down about it went down about 30 feet. They drove 160 piles down into this hole, wooden piles, and then they just built a concrete and masonry pier on top of it. And so that was Pier Number 1 for the new bridge. But the piers out in the river itself were more problematic. And so this would be piers number 2, 3, and 4 had to be sunk with what was called the pneumatic process. And so what they're doing in this picture is this is a wood caisson. And the caisson is just a big wooden box built with very heavy timbers. So the roof of this caisson would be about 5 feet thick of wood, of these big wood timbers, and then they pump compressed air into it, and workmen by hand inside that caisson, in that compressed air, dug the hole that the piers rested on all the way down to bedrock. And in the case of the Omaha Bridge, they had to go down about 90 feet to bedrock under the river. And so keep in mind, as you went down, I believe for every you had to increase the pressure a certain amount for every 27 inches you went down, something like that. And so by the time you got down to 90 feet, you had to have about 40 psi of pressure, which is about 3 times what 15 psi's of normal atmospheric pressure. So there was all kinds of problems with this. First off, it was dangerous. It could at any point something could rupture and the river would just run in and flood everybody. But also it caused if you had to decompress as you came out of it, just like as if you go deep diving. And so they had what they called caissons disease often, and that's what we call the bends today, where gases like nitrogen would dissolve in your blood under that pressure, and as you came out, it would just cause terrible pain in your joints and could cause heart problems. People lost their hearing and had problems with eyesight, all kinds of issues with this. But very dangerous work, but essential to how they built a lot of these bridges at this time. And here we have a picture. Then Pier 5, which is on the Nebraska side, which is the structure right here, it did not have to go to bedrock. Since it was on the end of the bridge, it went down about 60 feet, and at that point they found they were on a layer of hard blue clay, and they decided they didn't have to go any deeper. So they went about 30 feet less deep than they did for the piers in the middle of the bridge. I like this picture because we got some horses or mules drinking out of the river. So then once the pier construction was the big issue. That took about 3/4 of the length of the whole project as far as time. And then they started building the superstructure. So the workers from Baird Brothers, and they just put that together like an erector set. And so here in this side, span A, which is the first one on the Iowa side, has been completed here, and they're building span B. So we're between piers 2 and 3 here, and they put these up in just it took just a couple of weeks to put one of these spans up once they had those piers constructed. And so the new Omaha Railroad Bridge opened on the 5th of December, 1888. It actually had been test opened already in late November, and completely funded by the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, or at least its Omaha Railroad subsidiary, and it cost a total of $1.5 million. And so here we get a look at what it would have looked like when it was first built. So you had the 4 spans going across. You can see here's the approach that goes up to that. Since the bridge is 50 feet above the river, they had to have a long incline to get up to that height, and then they had to build a long trestle over on the Nebraska Street side to get it back down to ground level on that, and you can kind of see that in the distance. And in this picture, we have the beginnings of what is the Sioux City Stockyards district. This is what was called the Silberhorn Packing Company, you see here. And down here is the ground. Well, first off, you have Half Moon Lake. We see a little bit of that, where Pulaski Park is today. And then this is the elevated railroad's ground line going out to Morningside, which was just being developed at that time. You even have a little group of guys that are working on the elevated line. So this is a great photo, one of my favorite photos. So everybody was real happy when the Omaha Bridge opened, and then they found out that even though the Omaha Railroad had promised to lease the bridge to other railroads for reasonable rates, that they didn't actually stick to that, and the Sioux City interests felt that the Omaha Railroad was charging unfair prices to use its bridge, and so they needed to build a second bridge. But the first thing they did, because that took some time to get together, the first thing they did was build the Sioux City Pontoon Bridge. And this was largely the work of Edward C. Palmer. And this is the father of the 2 men that founded Palmer Fruit Company, which became Palmer Candy Company. But the original Edward C. Palmer was a dry goods dealer. He had been in the grocery business and then in what was called dry goods. So anything that was not perishable, his business was in. And he founded what was called the Sioux City, Nebraska Pontoon Bridge Company. So here's the pontoon bridge that opened in 1889. And it was a pretty ingenious little structure. It was 185 boats that just floated in the river, and each one was attached to a 2,000-pound chunk of granite, and that held it in place. And then when a boat came along and you had to open it up, they'd just unhook a couple of the boats and let it swing free, and the boat would pass, and then they'd hook it back up. Now, it just so happened that this occurred right after the brewing and selling of alcohol was made illegal in Iowa after Reverend George Haddock had been murdered in Sioux City in 1886. And so all of the liquor interests moved over to what today is South Sioux City, Nebraska. And so you had a big liquor trade over there. And so a lot of people called this the Whiskey Bridge, the Whiskey Pontoon Bridge, to get across to the good times to be had on the Nebraska side of the river. And that operated until the Combination Bridge opened in 1896. Now, the Combination Bridge story is it's the most convoluted story we're going to talk about today. It started out as the Pacific Short Line Bridge, and it was largely the ideas of Donald McLean that we have here. Sorry, I don't have a great photo of him, but he was a railroad promoter, and then John Pierce, of course, from Sioux City, a big Sioux City developer. And the idea was that the Pacific Short Line Railroad was going to run through Sioux City out to Ogden, Utah, where it would connect with the Union Pacific Railroad, and that would put Sioux City basically on the Transcontinental Railroad. And so McLean and his group and John Pierce had what was called the Nebraska and Western Railroad, and they were going to build a line from their job was to build a line from Sioux City to O'Neill, Nebraska, which did happen in the early 1890s. Unfortunately, the rest of the line was never built across Nebraska, and eventually it connected at O'Neill with the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley Railroad, and eventually made its way to Casper, Wyoming. But that whole idea of connecting to the Union Pacific never happened, unfortunately. But what did happen is we got the Combination Bridge at Sioux City as a result of this whole scheme. And so the McLean and Pierce formed what was called the Pacific Short Line Bridge Company, which eventually took over an existing charter that the U.S. Congress had granted to Sioux City in 1888 to build another bridge, a second bridge at Sioux City across the Missouri River. And so the company got control of that charter, and then in May of 1890, it was amended to allow what was called the building of a low bridge. And so a low bridge was anything too short for big steamboats just to sail under, and it had to be a drawbridge of some sort. And so that was allowed. And so a bridge was designed by John Waddell, a big bridge designer from Kansas City, and he came up with what was a combination bridge. And so it was going to have railroad passage in the center of it, pedestrian walkways on either side of the railroad line, and then wagon roads on the outside. And so that was the combined nature of this bridge. So not only a railroad bridge like the first one, but something that the average citizen of Sioux City or South Sioux City could use. The bridge would be only 17 feet above the high level mark of the Missouri River, and so it had to have two draw spans. But instead of making a hinge bridge that raised up and down, it was a swing span on either side that could open up and allow the passage of boats that were too tall to go under the fixed spans of the bridge. So while this was going on, the bridge company built a trestle bridge across the Missouri River. So these are just wooden pilings that were drawn in or drove into the river, and they had a pontoon segment that they could open, and this is how they got supplies to the Nebraska side of the river from the Sioux City side when they were building both the line to O'Neill and the bridge itself across the Missouri. And here we have the very beginnings of the construction of Pier 3. So this is the first big pier out in the middle of the Missouri River. Construction began in August of 1890. This happens to be in October 1890. And what they're doing here is they're building the caisson that they're going to use to build the Pier number 3 for the Pacific Short Line Bridge. The substructure contractor for this was Suey Smith and Company from New York, who were very experienced bridge builders. And here's the big wooden caisson for Pier number 3. And so piers number 3, 4, and 5 were all sunk using wooden caissons and that same pneumatic process. And they had to be sunk to between 85 and 95 feet for each of those piers. And so that's how same process was used with compressed air to sink those piers. Now the the original Pacific Short Line Bridge Company got into financial trouble pretty quickly. By December of 1890, they had run out of money, and they had they basically declared bankruptcy at that point. And then for the next 2 years, Arthur Garretson, who was the kind of the leading developer in Sioux City, a banker and real estate developer here in Sioux City, worked to get control of both the bridge company and the Pacific Short Line Railroad itself. In the meantime, the Phoenix Bridge Company, which had the contract to build the superstructure of the bridge, they continued work sporadically in 1890 because they had already invested quite a bit of money, and so they continued some of the pier work that had been started. And so here we have a picture from March of 1893 when construction was still going on. Arthur Garretson got control of the whole operation in December of 1892, and by March of 1893, Piers 2, which are these two smaller round piers, and Pier 3 had been sunk to bedrock. So they were complete, and they had sunk Piers 4 and 5 to between 45 and 60 feet. So they were about halfway completed at that point. But then, unfortunately, the panic of 1893, a great stock market crash occurred in 1893, and Arthur Garretson's big company, the Union Loan and Trust Company, went bankrupt, and all the money disappeared to finish the bridge. And so the bridge project was completely suspended after April of 1893. And by that point, about $400,000 had already been spent on the work on the piers up to that point. And so then it just sat dormant for a couple of years. In 1894, the people of Sioux City approved a resolution to have a small tax, a sales tax that would raise about $300,000 to put toward continuing the bridge construction project. And then a company called the Credits Commutation Company was formed by Eastern capitalists that had invested in Sioux City in the 1880s and the early 1890s to kind of try to get back as much money as they could that they had lost in the panic of 1893. And the Credits Commutation Company sent out Fred Eaton as its general manager, and Eaton pretty quickly decided that the bridge needed to be completed that had been started. That was made a central plank of his recovery efforts. And so the project was restarted in May of 1895. And so here we have the two piers on the Nebraska side, Piers 7 and 6, were sunk in a different method than they called it the open dredging process. And what we have here, this is the caisson. It's an iron caisson for pier number 7, which is the Nebraska draw span, and then pier number 6, which was a fixed span. These are what the piers were built on, and on the next pier we'll show you how they were sunk, or in the next picture. So here they're actually completing those two piers. And so nobody had to actually go inside those iron piers. The substrata below the Missouri River on the Nebraska side was a little different and allowed the use of this method, where they would actually just kept sinking iron tubes on top of these caissons, and they used a power dredge that you see on the right-hand side of this photo, or on the left-hand to you, and they were able to just use that clamshell dredge to dig the mud and sand out to get down to bedrock. And they had to go down, again, about 90 feet to reach bedrock for those two piers. But because they were able to use this process, it went really quick, a lot quicker than when they had to use the pneumatic process. Now for the swing spans, to allow the passage of boats, these are the rollers that those swing spans sat on before they built the span on top of it. And those were originally opened. 8 men could open those spans by walking in a circle, and it was balanced good enough. They estimated that each man would have to push the equivalent of about 25 pounds in order to generate enough force to open up those big bridge spans on these rollers. So here we have the construction of the actual superstructure across by the Phoenix Bridge Company, who were out of Philadelphia, and they've already completed the Iowa side swing span here and the first fixed span, and they're working on the second fixed span going toward Nebraska in this picture. So the whole project then was completed between May of 1895 and it opened on January 21st, 1896. This is on the Iowa side, so you kind of get a sense of how it worked. The railroad ran through the center, and what you see here, is a big wall, a big metal wall. That the idea was, since you were driving horses across on the wagon portions of it, you didn't want the horses to be too close. They figured they would get scared by the train coming across, and so they built that big wall to separate the horses from the train. And so that's what you're seeing as that big wall across there. And here's the Nebraska side, and you can see this is the Nebraska swing span part. And so, in total, the what we ended up calling the combination bridge cost about $1.5 million, and then served Sioux City for the next 80 plus years. Here we have a picture of the Iowa swing span in action. So here's how it would swing out, and we have the steamboat Josephine going through in the early 1900s. Now, the combination bridge was a toll bridge from its opening in 1896 until 1951. It was owned by two different companies in its first phase, first by the Combination Bridge Company until 1916, and then by the Missouri River Bridge Company until 1938. In 1938, Dakota County, Nebraska got control of the bridge. And then they continued to charge a toll until 1951 when they finally paid off the bonds they had issued to purchase it. And at that point, it became a free bridge to use by everyone without paying a toll. And the Iowa and Nebraska highway departments agreed to maintain the bridge after that. In 1959, when Interstate 29 was being constructed on the Sioux City side, they removed the Iowa swing span, which would have sat right here, and to build the cloverleaf that connected Interstate 29 to the combination bridge. So here's the way it looked after it opened in 1960. So you have that first cloverleaf, which has undergone many different arrangements over the years, but that's how it would have connected then. So you can see, of course, you notice that the Missouri River is shrinking during all this time because you have the Pick Sloan project going on that was building the dams in South Dakota and North Dakota, and then also the Army Corps of Engineers was doing the revetment work on the lower reaches and channelizing it. And so the Missouri went from being about a mile wide in its biggest phase in its natural state to being a much narrower river, and so you just didn't need that four-span bridge anymore. Here we have the combination bridge at the end of its existence in 1980. In the 1920s, it was painted battleship gray, and I think so that's probably what most people, those that remember it, probably remember it as that color. And of course, the other thing that people remember is the floor of the bridge. When the streetcars quit using it in 1937, it had originally been a wood plank floor, and they ripped that up and put in metal grating, and that's what you drove across until its end. And so you can kind of see that in this photo looking down on the bridge. All right, now we get to the 4th Street Viaduct. So this is not a bridge across water; it's a bridge across railroad tracks in Sioux City. And I have a picture here of Maris Pierce, John Pierce's brother, who was mayor of Sioux City in 1892. And he helped the city council come to an agreement with two railroads to build the first 4th Street Viaduct in April of 1892. This is a picture. This happens to be during the May 1892 Floyd River flood. But there's a great picture of these business buildings that are being constructed. And you can see they're being built on an incline to conform with the viaduct that was planned to be constructed on 4th Street. And that opened then, the first 4th Street Viaduct opened in November of 1892. And the two railroads, which were the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha, and the Illinois Central, paid 2/3 of the cost, and the city of Sioux City paid 1/3 of the cost. And unfortunately, I don't have a real great vintage picture of the viaduct, but here's the way it would have looked in its original state, and it cost about $150,000. Here's a picture of the old viaduct just before it was replaced. This is a picture from 1983, and when this was replaced in 1984, they kept the stone abutments from 1892, and they still are used on the 4th Street Viaduct to this day. The next big viaduct was what was originally called the Wall Street Viaduct, and today we call it the Floyd Boulevard Viaduct, with the street name change. And the agreement to build the same thing, the streetcars system at the time wanted to be able to get over the railroad tracks that went through that area, and there were 4 railroads that had tracks, and so they had to come to an agreement with 4 different railroads, and that was done by Mayor William Sears on your left. And he was the last of Sioux City's mayors under the old ward system of government. And then the project was completed under the mayorship of Albert Smith, who was Sioux City's first mayor under the commission form of government, when it was completed in July of 1910. So here's some of the picture of the construction of the original Wall Street Viaduct being done by Frankman Brothers and A.Y. Bain of Minneapolis, and so they're building. And you can see it's largely an iron viaduct that they constructed. In the background of this photo, so in 1910, what you're seeing right here, this is the old trestle from the elevated railroad that had been built in the early 1890s to go out to Morningside. That it was still standing, parts of it in 1910, even though that had been abandoned long before. Here we have a picture of the completed Wall Street Viaduct. In the end, the Omaha Railroad, the Chicago Northwestern, the Great Northern, and the Milwaukee Railroad all financed part of it, as well as the Sioux City Service Company, which ran the streetcar line, and the city of Sioux City, and it cost about $200,000. Here we have a picture from very late in the original viaduct's existence in April of 1986, and you can see it was in pretty rough shape by then. But much like the 4th Street Viaduct, when this was replaced later in 1986, they continued to use the original masonry abutments on it to help save costs, and so those still are in use to this day. Now here we go to another military road bridge done under the mayorship of Wallace Short, who led an agreement with Union County, South Dakota, to build a new bridge across the Big Sioux River in 1922. And here we have a picture of the construction of that military road bridge, carried out by Schreiber Construction of Watertown, South Dakota. And so here they're constructing the bridge in 1922. And here's the completed bridge then that was used on Military Road until the mid-1970s. And this was funded 2/3 of it by the city of Sioux City and 1/3 of it by Union County, South Dakota. And it cost about $63,000. Now, here's an interesting viaduct that some people, most of us probably wouldn't think of, but it's called the Brewer Crossing Viaduct, and this was on West 4th Street. It was built under when Stuart Gilman was mayor of Sioux City in 1925, and it was built with an agreement with the Milwaukee Railroad and the Sioux City Service Company. And the idea was, at that time, West 4th Street came out of the bluffs right by where Earl May is today, out in the Riverside area. And this viaduct was necessary to get across those railroad tracks and the streetcar tracks that ran out to Riverside. And so opened in December of 1925 and was built by Klinger Construction Company of Sioux City. Here we have a picture later in the 1950s, still being used, and in the background's the old Gordon Twin Drive-In. And so to give you an idea of where we are in these photos. And that was used until 1973. And at that point, the piers that held up the old viaduct were deteriorating badly, and it was declared unsafe. And so they closed the viaduct, and eventually, instead of West 4th using that path, they used what we call War Eagle Drive today. And so it was replaced with the War Eagle Drive viaduct that is in use today. And then, of course, the biggest of the viaduct projects in Sioux City is what we call the Gordon Drive Viaduct, but originally the Grand Avenue Viaduct, done while William Hayes was mayor of Sioux City. And since it was built during the Great Depression, a lot of the funding came from the Public Works Administration, or the PWA, led by Harold Ickes, who was also Secretary of the Interior under Franklin Roosevelt. And it was also used funds from the state of Iowa and other sources and the city of Sioux City as well. But construction began in 1936, and here they're building the piers, which were reinforced concrete piers that were on a foundation of steel piling. And the work was carried out. The contractor was C.F. Lytle Company of Sioux City, a big contracting firm here in Sioux City. And the idea of the Grand Avenue Viaduct was to get across. It was to carry, basically extend Highway 20 as it came into Sioux City from the east. Across the tracks of the Chicago and Northwestern and the Omaha Railroad, the Floyd River, the streetcar tracks that ran in that area, to get across all of that stuff that's kind of in the Floyd Valley between the Greenville area and Sioux City. And so that was the reason for the viaduct. So here we have a picture of the girders being laid in 1937. And when this opened, it's about 4,800 feet long, and it was the longest viaduct of this type in Iowa. And it may well still be. I'm not sure about that. But it's certainly one of the bigger structures and has served Sioux City for many years. Here we have a picture then once it was completed, and we're kind of looking to the southwest in this picture from the Floyd Cemetery area. And so you can kind of get a sense of all the stuff that the viaduct carries you over in this picture. So largely funded by the federal government, really, through the PWA, and cost just shy of $1 million when it was built. Now, it was originally a 2-lane viaduct, and then in the 1960s, it was expanded to 4 lanes. This is a picture from March of 1966, and the two lanes on the south part south of the original viaduct are under construction. Here you can see the piers, and they're building the exit ramp onto Highway 75 in this photograph. And so you see that work going on. That work was carried on by Christensen Brothers of Cherokee and Goberson Smith of Ida Grove were the contractors for that. And here we have just a picture I took off of Google Maps since I didn't have a better one. And that was completed in August of 1966. It's opened partially and then fully opened in November of 1966. And this was funded 50% by the federal government and 50% by the state of Iowa, and cost about $1.8 million in 1966 to do those 2 lanes. Another phase of the project then opened in 1968, and that was the cloverleaf that connected Gordon Drive to Highway 75, and so that's what you see in this picture under construction and about to open. So basically, it's had a similar configuration since the late 1960s to the way it is right now. Another military road bridge. We've had a lot of bridges out there. So by the mid-1970s, that 1923 military road bridge was in pretty bad shape going across the Big Sioux River. And so at the time, the mayor of Sioux City was George Cole, and he and the city council agreed with the state of South Dakota to build a replacement bridge in 1975. And so here's a picture of the contractor. Hobe Engineering of Sioux City was the contractor, and the pilings being dug for the piers are being pounded down for the piers of the new bridge. And you can see the old bridge is still well, some type of temporary bridge anyway is in use in the background there. And that opened in November of 1976. And that bridge then was resurfaced just a few years ago between in 2019 and 2020. And this was financed by federal government funds, the city of Sioux City, and the state of South Dakota originally, and cost just shy of $1.7 million. Now, to finish up here, the 2 big bridge projects that kind of give us our situation across the Missouri River that we have today kind of trace the local official that's most credited with the building of what today is the Veterans Bridge and the Sergeant Floyd Memorial Bridge was Ernest Albertson, who was mayor of South Sioux City and a real estate dealer and one of the founders of SIMCO, the Siouxland Interstate Metropolitan Planning Council. And he started lobbying local congressmen and senators to get federal help to replace the combination bridge in 1964. And as a result of those efforts, 2 bridges were built. First, the Sergeant Floyd Memorial Bridge south of Sioux City, and then south of downtown Sioux City, and then the Veterans Bridge to replace the combination bridge. So here we have a picture of the building of the Sergeant Floyd Memorial Bridge. The piers that hold that up are basically steel piling was driven, instead of using a caisson or something like that, steel piling was driven down to bedrock, and then the reinforced concrete piers were built on top of that foundation. And so the idea of the Sergeant Floyd Memorial Bridge was to carry what at the time was called the US 520, or the Highway 20 bypass around Sioux City, around the south edge of Morningside and over into Nebraska. And so that little stretch, that bridge, is officially known by the Department of Transportation as the I-129 bridge. And here we have some building of some more of the substructure, and the substructure contractor for the Sergeant Floyd Bridge was Jensen Construction Company. Same would be true of the Veterans Bridge, and they're from Des Moines. And then the superstructure contractor was Pittsburgh Des Moines Steel Company, also of Des Moines, obviously. And so here they're putting the girders for the Sergeant Floyd Bridge across. So here we have the completed bridge, opened on the 22nd November 1976, and today it carries both Highway 20 and Highway 75 across the Missouri River into Nebraska, where they continue on. And it was funded 90% by the federal government, and the remaining 10% was split by Iowa and Nebraska. It cost $31 million when it was constructed. And here's just another picture of the 520 bypass hadn't been completed at this time. And so you can see what was happening. Here's the Floyd Bridge, and you go up to here's Lakeport Street. And so this is preparing for the construction of the Southern Hills Mall. Hadn't been constructed yet. East High School and Nodlin Elementary over here. And so they're still going to build the bypass around when this photo was taken. The mall would be right in this area, right here. So all of that was in its developing stages at that point. Now, simultaneously, on that very same day that the Sergeant Floyd Bridge opened, the ground was broke for the Veterans Bridge, and so here we have state and federal officials breaking ground for the Veterans Bridge, and then that continued to be built between 1978 and 1981, and so here we have same contractors that built the Sergeant Floyd Bridge built the Veterans Bridge. So the substructure was Jensen Construction out of Des Moines again. Same idea, the reinforced concrete piers on a foundation of steel piling driven to bedrock. And this is officially known as, instead of the Veterans Bridge, the DOT knows it as the US Highway 77 Bridge into Nebraska. Here we have the picture of the superstructure being built, the big span across the river, and the superstructure contractor again was Pittsburgh Des Moines Steel Company out of Des Moines. So here we have the completed Veterans Memorial Bridge, which opened it partially opened in January of 1981 and was officially dedicated in July of 1981. Cost $28 million, and it was funded 80% of the cost by the federal government, and the remaining 20% were picked up by the state of Iowa and the state of Nebraska. Now, of course, as many people know, very quickly after the Sergeant Floyd or the Veterans Bridge opened, cracks were found in the outside girders of the tie girders on the outside of the bridge, and a total of more than 40 of those tie girders had to be replaced. And so, in quite a kind of embarrassing situation, the bridge had to be closed in May of 1982 while that work was carried out. It didn't reopen then until December of 1982, and wasn't fully reopened until May of 1983. So that was, I think, the biggest news story of 1983 was the Veterans Bridge, or 1982, the Veterans Bridge having the broken tie piers or girders. And let's see. Well, and then finally, I want to finish up with the replacement to the original Omaha Railroad Bridge, and that is with the current Burlington Northern Bridge that exists. The Burlington Northern Railroad was formed in 1970, I believe, and in 1973, it purchased the old Omaha Bridge in Sioux City. But the problem with that was, at that point, there were grain cars that were 100 tons, could haul 100 tons of grain, and that old 1888 bridge across the Missouri here at Sioux City couldn't. They were afraid to run that kind of weight across that old bridge, and so it really limited how much grain could be shipped west out of Sioux City. And as you can see, and so that they had to, in order to ship grain, they had to go way around Sioux City on both sides. And so that led Burlington Northern to build a new bridge in the early 1980s. So here we have the construction of the new railroad bridge taking place. You can see here's the old bridge, and they're building one of the piers right now, right there. And the contractor for both the substructure and the superstructure were Johnson Brothers out of Litchfield, Minnesota, and they're building reinforced concrete piers. And here we have, after the piers had been sunk, they're building the superstructure across, and the big iron steel truss that spans the river. In this picture, looking back toward the Iowa side from Nebraska. And here we have the first train to pass over the new bridge in December of 1981, and they're hauling one of those big, what they called a unit grain train that could haul those big 100-ton, pull one of those big 100-ton grain cars. And so fully funded by the Burlington Northern Railroad, which today is the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and costs about $14 million. And so here we have the bridge as it exists today, and with the old bridge removed. All right, well, I want to thank you for coming and spending your time with me for this lunch hour, and thanks so much.